Welcome. My name is Sharon Mitten and I'm the Head of Fundraising and Philanthropy here at the Florey. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, acknowledge the traditional owners of country on where we all are today. The Florey Institute is on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. We celebrate traditional owners as the first scientists and deeply respect their sophisticated knowledge systems. For those attending who are not familiar with our work, the Florey is the largest brain research group in the Southern Hemisphere. Our work is critical as diseases of the brain and mind affect all of us in some way. In fact, every year, 4.7 million Australians are diagnosed with one of the conditions we study. This year has highlighted the importance and need of our work more than any other since our beginnings. Topics which we live and breathe daily as a medical research institute have been under the spotlight and in the public sphere. That is why we've decided to explore our work in clinical trials as the last lecture topic for the year. We believe this to be both timely and pertinent to all our supporters and donors. And thank you to all our donors who've joined us this morning. As a medical research institute, our work relies heavily on your support. Another way you can support our research is by spreading the word about the Florey and the learnings you take away from this lecture today. If you're not already a Florey donor, we invite you to consider becoming one. All contributions, big and small, are tax deductible and take us one step closer in our quest to find the cures for diseases that affect the brain and mind. You can also support our work by leaving a gift in your will. If this is something you would like to consider, please email the fundraising team after the lecture and we'll be in touch with you soon. We'd also love to keep you up to date with the latest research happening at the Florey and invite you to join our mailing list if you're not already a subscriber. Please head to our website and scroll down the homepage to the red subscribe button. I'd now like to introduce you to our first very special presenter. Dr Tina Soulis is considered an industry thought leader and Australian international advocate for clinical trials. She contributes to, is a pivotal member of many Australian and international clinical trial, advocacy, policy, neurology-focused leadership groups. Over the past 9 years, Tina has built up Neuroscience Trials Australia, a leading global specialised brand, making Australia a destination for many overseas companies wanting to undertake neurology-focused clinical research. This contract research organisation is globally unique and offers clients access to clinical trial sites, expertise and capabilities required to complete clinical development at global standard. Prior to her role with Neuroscience Trials Australia, Tina was the Director of Clinical Development at Acrax Pharma Proprietary Limited, a successful Australian ASX 200 biotechnology company. Tina is an expert driver of clinical drug development, particularly in design, management and implementation of clinical trials. Has worked as a clinical researcher in senior roles within the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry for over 25 years. Her experience encompasses all stages of drug and device development in many therapeutic areas and geographical regions. I'm absolutely delighted to now hand over to you, Tina.
Thanks everyone for joining. I'm absolutely delighted to be joining this last public lecture from the Florey today and give you a little bit of insight into the work that we do at the Florey day to day in clinical trials. This year has been unprecedented in many ways, and we've heard that term being overused, but it's so true of clinical trials as well. Because I never remember a time in my 25-year career in clinical development and clinical research and clinical trials where we turn on the nightly 6 o'clock news and the first story is all about a clinical trial. And we open up the newspapers and there's dialogue on radio and on blogs. So for us as clinical trialists, it's very exciting. And I'm going to share the next 25, 30 minutes taking you through the journey of what we do day to day, some of the terminology and some of the work that we are involved in. So as Sharon beautifully described who we are a contract research organisation. We are owned by the Florey, and we're very unique because there's no other contract research organisation that is owned by a research institute. That means also that we're not on the stock exchange. We're not there for private shareholders. Whatever surplus we make of a project at the end of each year ends up going back to support basic research at the Florey. It also means that I have a wonderful team of 40 staff or thereabouts with an amazing experience in the global, with an average of about 14 years, but I can tell you that most of us have at least 20, 25 years experience in the industry, either working for pharmaceutical companies, biotechnology companies, other global contract research organizations. And a contract research organization is just that. So we contract out our expertise to make and to support pharmaceutical companies, device companies, biotechnology companies to undertake their project. So it may mean that we design the clinical trial for them. It may mean that we reach out to all the sites, which we call them sites, you may know them as hospitals, to undertake the clinical trial. We also work very closely with regulatory authorities, not just the Food and Drug Administration, which is the largest in the world, the FDA, but also our local Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is the TGA. We also set up the databases and the statistics for all the clinical trials that we undertake, or most of the clinical trials we undertake. And we analyze that data, we audit that data, and the end result is a clinical study report for each of the projects that we do. And we do that according to global regulations, which I'll talk about today. Most of the work that we do is on behalf of clients all over the world. In fact, 80% of the clinical trials that we're involved in originate from outside of Australia. We particularly work with Canada and the US, with the UK and European Union countries like Germany, Switzerland, Italy, France, but also we work with South Korean and Indian companies, and of course, New Zealand. Most of the work that we do are on behalf of commercial clients, so they're pharmaceutical, device, biotechnology companies, but it also means that about a quarter of the work that we do are projects funded by either the NIH, which is the FDA, granting arm, or the National Health and Medical Research Council here, or other collaborative groups such as MS Research Australia. And I'll spend the next few minutes talking about the environment that we find ourselves in day to day. Most of us probably have heard of some of the local success stories with global impact that here in Australia we're very proud to have been involved in. You may have heard Howard Florey and the involvement in the discovery of penicillin. You may know that the bionic ear and the cochlear implant was discovered and developed in Australia. What a huge impact that's had on many people's lives. You may also know that the world's first anti-flu drug, Relenza, was developed right here in Australia. If you use Aerogard, that was also an Australian discovery. More recently, Gardasil, and we've had a pivotal role to play in the development of the first vaccine to prevent cervical cancer and eradicate cancer. You may not know, though, that when you walk down the corridors of the Royal Melbourne Hospital, about 50, 60 years ago, probably 70 years ago now, a very prominent psychiatrist, Dr. John Cade, also worked at the Royal Melbourne, and he decided to treat his patients that had conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar with lithium. And he found that there were some benefits to treating those type of patients with lithium. And because of that, lithium is now worldwide still used today as a product that has some benefits in those patient populations. So Australia is already well known for discoveries and impact globally of these products. We are very highly respected as a clinical research destination. And just like the scientists that I work alongside of at the Florey publish their scientific findings in peer-reviewed journals, there is a very prominent journal called Scientific American, and every June they generate what's called a worldview scorecard. And Australia always ends up in the top 10 or 12 of countries, both from innovation perspective and seen as a biotechnology leader. And when they put this scorecard together, they rank the countries based on different categories, such as productivity of the type of research that we do, the intellectual property laws, the stability and policy of our government, the enterprise, so how we support our workforce and education of our workforce. And consistently, Australia is seen as one of the most innovative countries in this particular area of biotechnology and research. So we have a great reputation, but that reputation also translates into the clinical trials and our health system. So we know year in, year out, there are at least 500,000 people around Australia, across Australia, that take part in a clinical trial, and at least 1,300, even more trials are ongoing in any given year in Australia. And our sector employs tens of thousands of people, but an example here also that is in 2016, the Food and Drug Administration approved 13 new drugs that year. And of those 13 drugs, 7 included data that was generated in Australia. So we definitely contribute a lot in terms of clinical trials. And also the ecosystem in Australia is that a lot of the public hospitals, be it Royal Melbourne, be it Alfred Health, be it Monash, and that's just in Victoria, they have a philosophy whereby you walk through the doors, you go to a clinic there, and they will offer you treatment A, B, or C, or clinical trial A, B, or C. So it's there. Clinical trials are there as another alternative for a treatment option as well. But how many clinical trials are there around the world? There's a fabulous website called Clinicaltrialsgov, and there is a lot of intelligence around clinical trials. So if you are diagnosed with a particular condition, have an interest in a particular condition, you can look up clinicaltrials.gov and either put in a particular company, or be it Alzheimer's disease or stroke, some terminology, and it will show you which trials are being conducted and by whom and which locations around the world. And as of 6th of November, we see here that there are nearly 357 registered trials on this website all around the world. It's no surprise the majority of the clinical trials are undertaken in North America, mainly in the US, followed by Europe. Increasingly in places like China, we see an increase in clinical trials there. And Australia contributes about 2% of the clinical trials registrations in the world. Now, this website used to be not compulsory to enter to register a particular company's clinical trial on the website. But what was happening about 15, 20 years ago was that some companies were not registering that trial or also not reporting negative trial results. So now the FDA have taken over the management of this clinical trial website, and it is almost law now that a company who is developing a particular product, be it a COVID vaccine, be it a drug for Alzheimer's or a device to treat epilepsy, if they don't register on this website before they randomize or enroll their first patient on a trial, they will not necessarily be able to include the data of that clinical trial in registration of that product. And the whole point is that to provide transparency so that we can all learn about various clinical trials, we can learn from clinical trials that are failures, and it creates this huge database to better design trials in the future as well. So clinical trials is a risky business. In the world that we live in, most of the clinical trials don't work the way we want them to work. And it is no secret that for every 10,000 compounds that we synthesize in a laboratory these days, only one will ever make it to market. And that one drug will likely take 10 to 12 years to get to market, and it will cost 2 billion Australian dollars. And I'll go through why that is and why it takes so long. Now, this is a generalization. So we've seen already this year in the COVID vaccine world that this pathway to market from discovery right through clinical trials and registration of the product has been fast-tracked. And certainly in areas of high unmet need, be it Alzheimer's disease, be it a rare pediatric condition or another rare disease such as motor neuron, the pathway can be negotiated with the regulators so that it is decreased in time. And what the regulators do with the companies that own the product, that are developing the product, they'll support them to get the information to market quickly, and then they'll negotiate a safety, or what we call a pharmacovigilance database, so that they're looking at trends of what that product, what they're seeing in terms of adverse events, or in other words, side effects, and any other reportable events when that product has gone to market. And they're doing that at risk, but because it's an unmet need. The evolution of clinical trials goes back to biblical times. The first time that we see an clinical trial being reported was in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. But really, the evolution of the framework of the current rules and regulations that we work with these days in clinical trials really came out of several events. The first event was what was going on during World War II with the atrocities of the Hitler regime, where they were pretty much, I guess, abusing minority groups at that time, be it people of colour, be it twins, be it, of course, certain ethnicities as well. And from World War II came the Nuremberg trials. And from those Nuremberg trials, we created the Nuremberg Code, and more recently, the Declaration of Helsinki, giving anyone participating in a clinical trial certain rights, confidentiality and safety being paramount to the process of clinical trials. More recently, in the 50s and 60s, you may have heard of the thalidomide events, whereby a drug was being used for pregnant mothers for nausea. But as we now know, that drug was very dangerous. It caused a lot of birth defects. And because at that time too, in the modern world, pharmaceutical companies could register a product and make certain claims to that product, being able to, treat diseases and have certain effects. And because of thalidomide, in 1962 in the US, the Harris-Kefauver amendment was put in place. And really, in non-scientific terms, those laws then meant that if you were going to make certain claims about your product and wanted to register a product, you had to have evidence to support that. And therefore, this is why we do such complicated and long clinical trials, that whole process. So in the early 90s or mid-90s as well, the European Union, Japan, and the US got together to form the International Conference of Harmonisation. And those set of rules for the way that we undertake clinical trials and the rights and well-being of the participants in clinical trials were finalised in 96, and they were annotated and accepted by our regulators, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, in the year 2000. But really, they're a global set of rules. So whether we do a clinical trial in Czechoslovakia, in Japan, in the US, in Australia, we all follow the same rules. And that means that the data is mutually acceptable to these jurisdictions. The rules are all about the protection of clinical trial subjects and their confidentiality. The rules dictate that we must be able to substantiate whatever clinical trial we're going to do is scientific and has an ethical approach, has scientific rigor, and it's international standards. Now, the International Conference of Harmonisation Rules, or ICH, they have different chapters, and Chapter 6 is really what we work with, and that's Good Clinical Practice, or GCP. Now, GCP is our rule book. It's our Bible of how we run clinical trials day to day. And again, they are global rules. They can vary slightly from country to country, but the whole concept is what we all work towards. But really, good clinical practice is a standard for how we design and conduct, how we monitor, how we perform the clinical trials, how we record the data that we collect, how we analyse and how we report it. But really, it's there to provide assurance that the data and the reported results of any clinical trial that we do are credible, are accurate, they're a real account of what's occurred in that clinical trial, and that the rights, the integrity and confidentiality of the trial subjects are protected. In about 4 years ago, there was an updated revision of good clinical practice, which was introducing risk management plans and a quality system at the trial sites, but also for the sponsors. And right now, as we speak, there's also revision 3 of good clinical practice. And I'm really excited by revision 3 because it is all about introduction of virtual clinical trials, because Just like anything in our lives now, everything is much more remote and electronic, but it also is all about including patient advocacy groups and patient groups in the design of clinical trials as well. So why do we undertake clinical trials? I've spoken about the rules being in place to protect the participants that are taking part, but really when we're developing a new product or device, it's all about establishing an evidence-based data to prove that that product is safe and can be tolerated at a particular dose that we want to take to market. And we want to find which group of participants or patients, what indication we're going to register that product for. This is a really complicated slide, and I'm going to go to the nth degree, but I just wanted to demonstrate, and thank you to Cure for MND Foundation for this slide as well, but it really demonstrates the whole process of clinical trials that we work with day to day. And even before we get to clinic, there may be 5 to 7 years of animal work and in the lab work that needs to be done to establish. There are rules and regulations about the minimum amount of preclinical or animal data that is required. And that data we put together in what's known as an investigator brochure. And that's the data that we need to provide to the regulators and to the ethics committees to convince them, along with the study protocol, that we have enough data on this product to take from animals to humans. And therefore, then we start phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies. And all of this data then gets put towards a regulatory dossier and gets submitted to regulators like the FDA, like the TGA. And they will then take about 10 months to review that data. And they will reassess every single data point and redo all of the statistics. And therefore, you can see all of the time adding up to that 12 to 15 years. But if we look at it in a less complex way, all the data in clinical trials is put towards a regulatory dossier. But traditionally, we start off with a first-in-human phase 1 study. In the traditional sense, a phase 1 study is the first time that a new product is given to a human being. And traditionally, we use healthy volunteers, not the patients or indication that is intended for. And the whole reason is that we need to work out things like pharmacokinetics, which is what happens in the blood once we give, how long does it stay in the bloodstream, what other side effects do we see. And the very first dose that we give to any participant in a phase 1 study is called a sentinel patient. And that's on the very lowest dose. We usually wait 2 or 3 days, depending on what we think, how long it's going to take to get out of the bloodstream. And we then start treating the rest of that cohort, the rest of the group with the lowest dose. We then meet, a data safety committee meets and goes through all of the data that we have to make a go or no-go decision to go to the next dose and then the next dose. So we collect a lot of information for phase 1 that then allows us to go into phase 2. Now, there are some areas of clinical research that we do where it's just not ethical to go into healthy volunteers. And really good examples of that is most of the oncology drugs that are being developed and even some unmet need drugs such as motor neuron disease, for example, we bypass healthy volunteers and go straight in the patient population. So we go straight into phase 2, which is looking at the group of patients that drug is ultimately intended for. And these phase 2 studies are also all about safety, first and foremost. They're proof of concept. And they're usually looking at working out things like the dose, what dose works. Do we have to give the drug once a day, twice a day, some other regimen? But there might be multiple studies in the phase 2 program, because what we're trying to work out is not just the dose and the safety and how well the drug is tolerated. And when I say drug, I mean devices as well, or whatever therapeutic agent that we're developing. And it could be also that we want to work out interactions. So when you get something at your doctor's surgery and they give you the script and you go and pick up that script and you open up the packet and there's a little piece of folded paper, if you note next time, it usually should have a summary of all the clinical studies that are done. And those studies will tell you what the contraindications are. So it might say that with this particular product, you can't take Panadol, you can't take some other health supplement. This is all the information that we gather during phase 2 clinical studies in the patient population. Then we have to do phase 3 pivotal studies, and that is at the dose that we're going to take to market. It could be more than one dose. in the patient area that we intended to treat the product with. And traditionally, again, we have 2 pivotal phase 3 studies. And traditionally, companies have done 1 phase 3 study in the US and 1 in the rest of the world, which then includes Europe, Australia, maybe Asia. And again, we've seen this whole process being condensed very much through the COVID vaccine period as well. So as I said before, all of this data, as well as the preclinical data, as well as the manufacturing data of a product, all the components, whether if it's an inhaler, if it's an injectable, all the components, everything is put together into a regulatory dossier, submitted to the authorities, and then there is dialogue when they have a period of reviewing every single data point. The databases that we use throughout these trials have to be compliant to all the regulations. We don't just use Excel spreadsheets, for example. They have to have an audit trail. We can't, certain people have certain privileges. We might be able to view some of the data, but we cannot enter the data. We can audit the data. And that's a lot of the role that my staff and I do, where we go in and we do what's called monitoring of the clinical data, because we need to establish that whatever is in the documentation or the case report forms for a particular clinical trial is also reflected in the medical records of the participant. And it's a true and accurate record. And if something is not recorded, then it didn't happen in our world. So there are many, many stakeholders. It's not just about a doctor-patient in a clinical trial. We talk about sponsors of clinical trials, and they're usually the folks that are funding the clinical trial or own the intellectual property. Of course, we have the doctors, the nurses, the pharmacists that are involved. And the doctors in clinical trials, the terminology we use are principal investigators. Sometimes we need MRIs, laboratories, so we do use imaging facilities. More often than not, in the neurology world, because of the very vulnerable nature of the participants that we use, we need to involve their family and their caregivers in the clinical trials as well. Of course, we put all the data together and we need the trial to be approved by Human Research Ethics Committee. And again, the rules of the Human Research Ethics Committees are global, and they need to be made up of a man, a woman, a scientist, someone with the legal or lawyer or legal degree, a minister of religion. That's just some of the basic components of any ethics committee. We usually work with pharmacies or central depot that dispense the drug throughout. Data management is a huge, huge industry in itself in clinical trials, because we need to make sure that the data is validated, it can't be changed by anyone, and there's that audit trail. We work very closely with the regulators, as I've said before. And of course, and more we're seeing home-based services, so the trial going to the participants, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a few more minutes. So just like when you buy a new appliance at home, you look at the manual. When you cook, you look at a cookbook for the recipe. When we undertake a clinical trial, we have what's called a clinical trial protocol, and that sets out the study procedures and dictates how the study will run. And the main elements of the clinical trial protocol, of course, are the study design, whether it includes a placebo, is it open label, is it blinded to everybody, the background, which includes all of the information to date about that product, justification as to why we're including the number of patients we're including, the statistics behind that, the primary endpoints. Are we looking that drug A is better than drug B? Are we wanting to see a 30% seizure decrease with our drug at the end of 12 weeks of treatment, for example? And every single procedure and every single study visit is in this document. We must follow this very strictly. And if the sites don't follow, because it's simply the nature of life, I guess, we write down something that has deviated as just that, a protocol deviation. Some protocol deviations need to be reported to the Human Research Ethics Committees as well. And if there are any major amendments, then we need to amend the protocol formally and get approval before we start using the amended protocol by the Ethics Committee as well. Informed consent is also a huge factor of doing any clinical trial, because it must be voluntary, and it basically is a confirmation that a participant in a clinical trial is willing to take part in that clinical trial on a voluntary basis. We need to obtain informed consent before any study-specific assessments are undertaken. Usually informed consent is obtained face-to-face, but it's okay once a study is approved by an ethics committee for that particular hospital to send the informed consent out via mail or email and give an opportunity to the participant to talk to their family about it, to talk to their general practitioner about it. But it's really about determining that the participant, the person taking part in the clinical trial, understands what the trial is about, what assessments they will undertake, and that they have a right to withdraw from the trial for any reason at any point of time. The key elements in the informed consent form are listed here, and of course they include the introduction, the duration, any risk to benefit that's known to date about that clinical trial, if there is randomization or assignment to different groups, if they're going to be reimbursed. And interestingly, in Australia, we only pay healthy volunteers for phase 1 clinical trials, but if you're involved in a phase 2 or 3 study, you will be reimbursed for time for your meals, but also time to travel to and from the hospital site. The confidential nature is also underlined in this document, how the results and who will see the results and how they will be shared, who to contact if you've got any questions, and you need to sign the informed consent form. When I first started in clinical trials about 25 years ago, these documents were about 10 pages. These days, they can be anywhere up to 35, 50 pages long. But they are. The nice thing is that they're not written for scientists to read. They need to be pitched at a 12-year-old reading level. So they're meant to be for the everyday person not involved in clinical trials and a non-scientist to be able to understand the whole process. But what does it mean if you're involved in a clinical trial? It usually means that a new product, a device, a clinical practice will be assessed, and you may or may not get benefit from that project. You'll be assessed for eligibility of the trial, and you'll only be involved in the clinical trial if you fulfill all of the eligibility criteria. And I guess that means that we are assessing apples with apples. No study-related procedures will be undertaken until the trial has been approved by the ethics committee and that you've signed the consent form. Participants need to come in for study visits over a predetermined time point for predetermined assessments. You'll be asked lots and lots of personal questions, but you are free to withdraw at any point of time for any reason. And ultimately, the results will be published and data disseminated. So that's really the whole philosophy of what it means to be involved in a clinical trial and a clinical trial process. We've heard a lot about adverse events, and of course, whenever we undertake any clinical trial, whether it's phase 1 or phase 3, it's all about safety and establishing safety. And the way that we record safety is we record any adverse events in the clinical trials in our databases, and they can be unfavorable, untended signs, that can be laboratory signs, any symptoms, or any disease temporarily associated with the treatment. And it could be, for example, even if you break your leg and you're involved in a clinical trial, that's an adverse event that we need to know about. And because what we do then is we classify whether it was related to the taking of the investigational product on the trial or not. But we need to record any safety events that have occurred to you from the time you've signed informed consent to the time that you leave the trial. Some adverse events become serious adverse events. Again, there's a universal definition of serious adverse events. They either cause death, are life-threatening, require you to stay in hospital for longer or require you to end up in hospital. They result in a persistent or significant disability. They result in a congenital abnormality or birth defect or any other important medical event deemed by your doctor who's looking after you on the clinical trial. And if the serious adverse event is unexpected and is shown to be probably, possibly, or definitely related to you taking the investigational product, then we are obliged by law to report it within a certain time frame to the regulators, be it FDA or TGA. A famous serious adverse event, I guess we saw only in September of this year, when it was reported in the news that the AstraZeneca clinical trial on the COVID vaccine had been paused due to a serious adverse event. And you may remember this incident, but really at that time, it was because the serious adverse event that had been reported was unexpected. And they thought at that time that it may have been caused by the vaccine. So this is a usual way and a usual event of clinical trials, but it's there again so that we learn more about the product, the safety and also, I guess, the safety, it comes first and foremost of the clinical trial participant. Just a little bit moving into some of the work that we do. If I had asked you 5 or 6 years ago, had you heard of motor neuron disease, most of you probably would have said you had not. But we know then, due to events like the Ice Bucket Challenge, that the, I guess, brand awareness of this disease has increased all around the world to the benefit of these people that have been diagnosed with this terrible disease. And I just also want to pay homage to Patrick Quinn, who actually started the Ice Bucket Challenge and who I heard this morning on the news had passed away in the US. But we've been really fortunate to be working with folks like Neil Danaher and the late Ian Davis, who's the gentleman here with the baby, holding the baby, who started Fight MND. And we do routinely work with patient advocacy groups and clinical trial networks to increase brand awareness, I guess, of different clinical trials and conditions. And in this case, these guys have been amazing and are leaving an amazing legacy for future generations because they've raised over 80 million since 2016. And why I think they're amazing is because if you had looked on clinicaltrials.gov in 2016 and typed in ALS, which motor neuron disease is known as in the rest of the world, you can see that Australia has nothing next to it. There were 0 clinical trials in ALS or motor neuron disease 4 years ago, even though there were 2 products to treat the condition. If you looked in 2018 in August, you can see that all of a sudden there were 5 clinical trials now registered, being undertaken in Australia. And these days there are about 6 or 8 ongoing clinical trials in motor neuron disease. And I'm really proud to work with organisations like Fight MND to bring all our capabilities together and bring in these clinical trials for patients that need them the most. It not only creates jobs from an industry level, but most importantly, we get these scientific and really important medications to people that need them the most, and hopefully to market. This is another example of a clinical trial project that we've been really delighted to be involved in. It's a company called Cognition Therapeutics, and we've been working with Cognition Therapeutics for about 5 or 6 years now. Now, on the left of the slide, you'll see that there's around like a dart-looking graph, and it unfortunately shows a lot of the failures in Alzheimer's disease and the new chemical entities that are being developed. And we've learned a lot in the past 5 to 10 years in Alzheimer's disease clinical trial development and a new product development, I should say. What the big pharmaceutical companies have realized, and they've spent billions of dollars in developing Alzheimer's disease new chemical entities, is when they look back on some of the data, they realized that not all of the participants involved in these trials actually had Alzheimer's disease. Since that time, we now screen the participants in some of these studies really to the nth degree, because now to be included in a trial for a new chemical entity for Alzheimer's disease, you usually have to have a sample to see whether you have got a particular gene. It's either the tau gene or beta amyloid gene. You also usually have to have a PET scan to see if you've got amyloid beta plaques in your brain. And those 2 factors usually mean that you're going to develop or have Alzheimer's disease. So we've learned a lot through these clinical trials, as I said. But Cognition Therapeutics came to Australia. They opened up a small office in Australia. And the other lovely thing that I didn't mention at the start is if a small company like Cognition Therapeutics would come to Australia and open up a company, they can claim 43.5% back on whatever research and development they do. So from a costing point of view, it also makes sense as well. But they came and they did a healthy volunteer project first. They then did a small phase 2 study in just a small cohort of Alzheimer's disease patients. They took the data of both of those 2 trials, they took it back to the FDA, and they were able to negotiate the clinical trial pathway of their particular product. And right now, we are also helping them in a big global phase 2 study. So this is a very good example of the type of work that we're involved in. So we start off local, we start off small, helping the particular companies. They take that data, they save money through the R&D tax incentive, they open it up to the rest of the world, and everybody benefits, not just our own local patients groups as well. One of the most important concepts, again, of clinical trials these days, traditionally clinical trials were recruited by the doctors involved. They would look at their databases, the patients that they were seeing, and then recruit from there. These days, it's really important to get to the participants, directly as much as we can, and allow people to know that these clinical trials are ongoing. And just like Facebook and those social media platforms, they are all used in the clinical trial work that we do. And so most of the clinical trials that we're involved in also mean that we have a social media strategy attached to them. And what I've done here in the green box, you can see that is one of the pharmaceutical companies had created their own website. So if you Googled a clinical trial for Alzheimer's disease, the chances are that the Generation program would come up, and be it the participants themselves or a loved one, being a grandchild or their parents, would find this and would be able to register their expression of interest and learn more about the disease state and learn more about what this company were doing for clinical trials. Even more recent to that are things, wonderful initiatives like the Healthy Brain Projects. And that is tapping into, I guess, people that are concerned or interested about maintaining their memory and their brain health. And this is meant to be like a longitudinal database, I guess, of keeping people engaged and having an algorithm in the backgrounds to work out a certain tipping point, and when someone gets a certain score, to then allow them to know about a clinical trial. So again, maintaining the audience and connecting with the audience to engage them in the clinical trial process, but also informing them about the different projects that are happening. Right now, the future is really exciting for us because just like anything, it's moving at a rate of speed, lightning speed with regards to the development of these products. No longer is it just all about a tablet that we take and we come back to see the doctors once a month to undertake the study visit. More and more, we're seeing a very high volume of complex data, and the products themselves are not just pharmaceuticals. They involve engineering teams, and underlying everything that we do are very complicated and sophisticated information technology systems. And that is the future of clinical trials, which has been really accelerated in the COVID times, where we're now seeing what we call virtual trials or decentralized trials. And we're actually even working on trials where we actually don't get to see the participant at all anymore, not even at the trial site. Everything is done virtually. So examples of this as well, of the new world that we're living in, is we're using virtual reality in clinical trials now. There have been examples where chronic pain has been treated, as well as acute pain, anxiety, with a virtual reality tool. Virtual reality tools are even used to teach patients about their treatment plans, about different parts of the anatomy. And more recently, there is even a company here attached to the Royal Children's Hospital that are using a virtual reality platform to teach particularly pediatric patients not to fear needles or to overcome their fear of needles. More and more, we're doing remote clinical trials, and we already know that we're using iPhones and iPads for the participants to directly enter their data of the clinical trial. So we've got 24/7 continuous data being generated. We can deliver investigational product directly to someone's house. We can now access patients in remote, in rural areas, which is really exciting for those populations. And we also are doing a lot of home-based visits. So there are now companies that have got a group of nurses that will actually go out to the participant site and collect bloods and collect the data that they need for the visit. So it decreases the patient burden and makes it easier, particularly for vulnerable populations, for their loved ones to help them be involved in clinical trials as well. And I just wanted to also end off by saying that we are, as I said, living in a very exciting period for clinical trials, where we're seeing this emergence and acceleration of decentralized clinical trials. Just like anything in our world, we are now seeing deep learning, machine learning, artificial intelligence algorithms behind the very day-to-day use of our clinical trials and the systems that we use. But I guess there are considerations, just like anything, that we as an industry are working out in the next 2 to 5 years about who owns the data, how secure is the data that we're using, and how private is the data. And some of the considerations I want to leave you with things like overcoming the fragmented nature of our healthcare systems. And if you think of Australia, we have a federal healthcare system, but we know that the hospitals are run by the state. So we need to work out a standardized system about using clinical trials and the system that we have to collect the data. The exciting thing for me is ultimately we're going to have one central data repository for all of the clinical trials for a particular product, for a particular company, which means that we don't have to work behind the scene to connect it all at the end of the clinical trial process, which also means that the regulators won't have to put it into specific format for the regulators. We're going to do that right from the start. And therefore, ultimately, it means that there will be more transparency about the clinical trial process, the clinical trial data. And it also means that people can have more ownership in their own healthcare data, because even right now, we've got participants that are entering their data on iPhones, as I said, on iPads and other platforms. And we might even see a period, and we're starting to see this already, that participants and patients and researchers may exchange health data for payment. But overall, it's going to mean a very transparent and increased burden of responsibility around the data security for all of the companies involved, be they pharmaceutical, biotechnology, healthcare companies, and even contract research organizations like ourselves. But we're really in a period of just making everything so much better in the whole process, and hopefully decreasing that 12 to 15 years that it takes. Because what we'll also learn from transparency of this data is designing clinical trials much better. And there are certainly companies that already exist that mine the data on social media and the data on clinicaltrials.gov to allow us to better design the trials. And hopefully we need fewer trials for every development of a particular product. So I might leave it there because I might have gone over time, and I will hand over to my colleague.
Just before we hand over to Claire, thank you so much, Tina. It is indeed fascinating and wonderful to hear the important work Neuroscience Trials Australia does, particularly in such a highly regulated and complex health environment. Certainly significant to hear that it takes an average of 12 to 15 years to develop a drug at an average cost of $2 billion. It is indeed a long haul from discovery through to approval. Glad to hear also that you're making inroads into improving this timeline. Well done, Tina. It's exciting also to know that you're attracting trials globally. Now, our second very special presenter today is Claire Cuddy. Claire manages the Human Stem Cell Laboratory in our Ion Channels and Human Disease Laboratories of Professor Steve Petro, and Epilepsy Functional Genomics Laboratory of Associate Professor Snezana Maljevic. Claire completed her Bachelor of Biomedicine with honours at the University of Melbourne in 2011, and since then has worked as a research assistant in human stem cells and modelling of neurological development and disease. Claire supports the workflow from patient sample to stem cells to disease modelling in a dish for the Petro and Maljevic laboratories at the Florey. Thank you, Claire. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Sharon. And thank you all for coming along today. So Tina spoke about clinical trials, and how this links in with clinical trials is that stem cell models can help us build our knowledge and understanding of diseases so that we can move towards clinical trials and potential therapies in the future. So this is really in the preclinical stages of research. So what is a stem cell? Stem cells have two key features. The first one is that they can self-renew, so they can keep dividing or replicating indefinitely to produce more and more. And the second is that they have the ability to turn into any cell type in the body. So we can turn stem cells into skin cells or blood cells, or in our case, because we're a neuroscience institute, quite often we're interested in turning them into brain cells or neurons. So all of this starts off with a patient sample, and usually this is a skin biopsy. And we take the skin cells from that biopsy and turn them into stem cells. And that process is referred to as reprogramming. Then from there, we turn the stem cells into neurons or brain cells. And that process is referred to as differentiation. So once we've got those neurons or brain cells, we can then conduct experiments with them. And we look at various factors. So we look at the chemicals that are being produced by the cells. We look at their functioning. So for brain cells, what we're looking for here is their electrical activity. We look at patient cells versus control cells to try to understand what are the cellular mechanisms that are underlying the disease. And we also look at with and without drug treatments to see, are there any potential therapies that might be beneficial? And we're doing all of this for an individual patient or for maybe a subset of patients to try to understand what's driving their disease and what therapies may be beneficial to them. So it's a personalized medicine approach. And just finally, I'd like to finish up by showing you an example of how this is done from our lab, where we model epilepsy using stem cells. So on the left, you can see that we have a readout from some stem cell models showing the electrical activity. And you can see that in the epilepsy patient model, there's much higher electrical activity than in the control. So from here, we have a platform to screen different drugs and see which drugs might bring that electrical activity level in the patient back down closer to the control level. I also wanted to give you a visual on how these stem cell models can look. So I'll just draw your attention to this video on the right here, which shows an example of the kinds of images of stem cell models that we can take. And these can inform us further about the disease process as well. So as I said, we're doing this to try to understand individual epilepsy patients, what's driving their disease, and what therapies may be helpful specifically to them. And if you think about everything that we know about a particular neurological disease as a puzzle, then you can consider stem cells are one tool we can use to add a few pieces to that puzzle to help build our knowledge of a particular condition. And the more that we build our knowledge on these conditions preclinically, that helps drive forward potential clinical trials and therapies in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire and Tina. I'm sure everyone in the audience agrees that that was very insightful. I'm still processing some of those numbers and trying to understand just how complex the world that you operate is, in fact. So thank you so much. We've had a few great questions. I realize I'm just conscious of time, but I think we've got time for 3 or 4 questions, hopefully. So I might just go straight into those if we can. Got a question for Tina, which has been sent through from Kevin. And Kevin is wondering, I'll just read it out to you, Tina. Do you see dramatic global increase in the use of home nursing visits continuing after COVID? Given the demonstrated impact on patient recruitment and retention, trial completion, through making trials more accessible and patient carer friendly. So I guess that's a very relevant one, given the current circumstances we've all lived through. What do you think about that, Tina?
Yes, thank you, Kevin, for the question, but definitely yes. And it's all about making the, as I said, the patient burden less so on the people that have, kindly given up themselves to take part in a clinical trial and having the trial come to you, if you like, as a trial participant. But definitely that one of the tools that we will be using are inclusion of home-based services to make it easier for people being involved in clinical trials. Post-COVID, yes.
Yep. Perhaps one of the silver linings of all this challenge we've been through. Thanks, Tina. Another question just from Annette. Annette is wondering, comparing Australia to other countries in terms of the COVID situation, how can Australia, what can we do to grow our clinical trial footprint here?
So this is my opinion, but it's all about brand awareness as well. And as I demonstrated before early on, we already have this great reputation for what the clinical trial work that we do. We have an amazing capabilities with the R&D tax incentive. We are quicker to get approval of clinical trials. So we just have to let everybody know that doesn't know that of what's going on in Australia and demonstrate the great work that we do. And I can also tell you that from a client perspective, we have been so busy the past, particularly 4 to 6 months, because we are in a more COVID-safe position, and also things like aspects of like political stability, that we are now seen as the destination to come to undertake clinical trials, just from those two aspects as well. So
it's the place to be. There is a question, and perhaps it might be difficult, but your opinion would be welcome. Someone has asked about contracts with China and how that sits at the moment in terms of Australia's trials. Did you want to answer that one?
Yes.
Tina?
So we don't particularly do a lot of work with China, but I can tell you that those clinical trials, if they had started before COVID, they are still happening in Australia. I'm not sure if they meant work that we do in China, which we don't so much, but definitely Chinese companies are still, just like US companies, UK companies are still coming to Australia to undertake their work, because a lot of the work we can do remotely.
So when a drug is applied to something it's not intended for originally, what trial stages can be skipped to get it available to patients?
Yes, so we see a lot of what's called repurposing of drugs, and that's the terminology that we use. And generally in that sense, because we have a lot of already clinical data on that product, we don't have to start in phase 1 and that healthy volunteer stage. We can go straight to the patient population. And generally we do what's called bioequivalence studies, where in the same trial, we put the existing drug versus something else, or it could be that you mainly skip that phase 1 clinical phase as well. So you do decrease the amount of clinical trials that need to be done. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think we could leave it there for today. I just want one last big thank you to Tina and Claire for sharing your amazing work with us. And a big thank you to all our donors who've joined us today for this special, the last lecture that we'll be holding for the year. We're so excited that you're all here on this journey with us in this clinical trial space and in all the research spaces we're currently operating in. We look forward to sharing more of these amazing updates with you next year in our public lecture series, which may be face-to-face, maybe virtual. We'll wait and see how it pans out. But yeah, we hope that everyone has a great end of the year, and thanks for joining us over this series. It's been a pleasure to share the research with you. And please share everything you've learned today and heard about the Florey in our work. Share it with your friends and family, because we consider that to be a really important part of this lecture series, getting the message out to the general public. So thank you. Take care, everyone.